Word of the rhinoceros's success spread through the ranks with extraordinary speed. Reports travelled from battalion to regiment, from regiment to division, and within hours they were on the desks of senior commanders. The hedgerow cutter was no longer an interesting experiment. It was a battlefield necessity. What the tanks had accomplished in those 2 hours against the German strongpoint was more impactful than what some units had achieved in several days of grinding combat. For the first time since the Normandy landings, there was a reliable way to break through the countryside's natural defences. Shortly after the battle, Major Jack Williams visited the forward staging area, arriving in a jeep kicking up mud along the narrow roads. He found Culin still inspecting the rhinoceros, running his fingers over the prongs as if trying to process what had just occurred. Williams stepped out, folded his map, and approached with brisk confidence. "Sergeant," he said, "I've spoken with division. Your device is being fast-tracked." Culin glanced up, unsure how to respond. The scale of what was happening hadn't fully settled in. "We want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week," Williams continued, "and that's just the start. General Bradley wants this across the entire front." It was almost too much to comprehend. 48 hours earlier, this idea existed only as sketches in a notebook. Now it was becoming part of official doctrine. The US Army, an organization known for procedure and hierarchy, was moving at lightning speed. Because one mechanic's idea had succeeded where conventional thinking had failed, the next days were a blur. Culin was temporarily reassigned to lead training and production. He moved from depot to depot, teaching welders how to replicate the modification. At first, some were skeptical of this crude arrangement. Steel prongs welded onto the front of a tank hardly looked like a refined engineering solution. But skepticism quickly dissolved once they saw actual combat footage of rhinoceros tanks ploughing through hedgerows that had stopped everything else. Unit after unit lined up with tanks needing modification. Welding crews worked in shifts, torches glowing red through the night. Beaches, once littered with Czech hedgehogs intended to halt the Allies, became convenient scrapyards providing raw materials for the cutters. The irony was not lost on anyone. German-made steel was now being used to defeat German defences. Culin became the central figure in this sudden industrial effort. He trained welders to measure the exact angle needed, about 15 degrees downward. Too steep, and the prongs would dig uselessly into the dirt. Too shallow, and they wouldn't cut roots effectively. He taught them how to reinforce welds so the prongs wouldn't snap under the stress of impact. His instructions were simple, clear, and precise, traits born from years of practical mechanical work rather than academic study. Welders and mechanics admired him, not just for the idea, but for his willingness to get his hands dirty alongside them. He didn't stand in the background giving orders. He picked up torches, inspected welds, and rebuilt prongs himself. It made the whole process feel less like a command directive and more like a collaborative effort. Then came the visit that forever cemented the invention's place in military history. General Omar Bradley, commander of US ground forces in Normandy, arrived to see the cutters in person. He approached as Culin was showing a group of new welders how to position their tools. When Culin noticed the general, he snapped to attention, nearly dropping his welding equipment. "At ease, Sergeant," Bradley said with a small smile. "I hear you've managed to do what every engineer in my staff headquarters has been unable to." Culin felt his face flush. "Just did what needed doing, sir." Bradley nodded. "Exactly. That's what good soldiers do. You solved a problem that was killing our men, and you solved it with scrap metal, a welding torch, and common sense. Remarkable." Right there on the muddy ground, Bradley informed him of 2 honours, a recommendation for the Legion of Merit and a field promotion to technical sergeant. The men around him clapped, some cheering outright. Culin accepted it all with humility, though inside he felt conflicted. Praise didn't erase the memory of the tank crews who had died before the cutter existed. Still, work went on. The more cutters they built, the faster the army advanced. Reports flowed in from every direction. Tankers praised the cutters for allowing them to breach hedgerows without pausing. Infantry commanders celebrated the newfound ability to move behind tanks that no longer had to crawl over obstacles. Many called it one of the most important battlefield innovations of the campaign. Soon, improvements emerged. Some crews added a fifth prong for better performance in extra-thick hedgerows. Others developed serrated edges to help slice through roots. One particularly clever innovation involved adding a debris-clearing system inspired by farm equipment, preventing earth from clogging the prongs after each breach. Culin welcomed every improvement. Innovation never ends, he told welders. If you can make this better, do it. The battlefield will tell us what works. By late summer, the cutter was no longer an improvisation. It had become standard equipment, part of Sherman tank doctrine, incorporated into training manuals and even considered in new tank production lines. What had begun as one man's desperate idea had transformed into a pillar of Allied strategy. But for Culin, the transformation brought not just pride, but a new uncomfortable reality. His invention had changed the war, and with that change came consequences he never expected. Success in war is never clean. Every advantage gained carries a shadow, unintended consequences, moral weight, and problems that reveal themselves only after the celebration fades. For Sergeant Curtis Culin, the triumph of the hedgerow cutter brought relief, pride, and recognition. But it also carried burdens he never anticipated. As the cutters spread across Normandy and the Allied advance accelerated, the cost of that acceleration became painfully clear. The first cost was human. Before the cutters, commanders had been cautious. They had no reliable way to break through hedgerows without exposing their tanks. Assaults were delayed, plans were scrutinized. Advancing blindly was too risky. But with the introduction of the cutters, a new confidence emerged. Tanks could breach hedgerows rapidly, almost aggressively. Infantry could follow close behind. Where caution had once reigned, momentum now took over. Some commanders began launching attacks they might once have postponed. The assumption was simple: if the tanks could punch through, the rest would follow. But war is never that predictable. Even with cutters, the enemy adapted. German units shifted anti-tank guns to new angles. They planted mines beneath hedgerows. They booby-trapped the routes. They dug deeper defensive pockets, waiting for Allies to burst through. In several cases, Allied units sustained casualties precisely because the breakthrough was possible. Tanks advanced farther, faster. Infantry pushed deeper. The lines stretched. Support didn't always keep up. Some attacks succeeded brilliantly. Others ended in blood and confusion. And though none of this was Cullin's fault, he couldn't avoid feeling responsible for the consequences of his invention being used so aggressively. He spoke to Chaplain Thomas O'Brien about it one evening as they stood beside a row of recently modified tanks. Rain pattered lightly against the metal, creating a soft rhythm beneath the chaplain's steady voice. "You gave them a tool," O'Brien said gently. "What commanders choose to do with that tool is not your burden." "But men died," Culin replied quietly. "Maybe more than if we'd moved slower." The chaplain shook his head. "Maybe fewer. Maybe the war ended sooner because of you. You don't get to know those numbers, Sergeant. None of us do. What matters is that you acted to save lives, not take them." Culin nodded, but the guilt lingered. He could not ignore the reality. Every time a tank burst through a hedgerow using his invention, someone on the other side, often a German soldier, died because of it. Saving American lives meant taking others. That was the cruel arithmetic of war. The second cost was logistical. Normandy's hedgerows had slowed the American advance to such a crawl that supply lines had naturally remained compact. But once the cutters enabled rapid breakthroughs, the front surged forward much faster than planners anticipated. Fuel trucks struggled to keep up. Ammunition resupply grew erratic. Mechanics had to chase after tanks spread across miles of countryside. Entire battalions sometimes found themselves advancing faster than their own support network could sustain. This created new dangers. Tanks ran low on shells, infantry ran low on rations. Even water became a concern in some areas. Culin attended several meetings where officers debated how to restructure supply chains to match the new operational tempo. Sitting among them, still a sergeant despite the honours, he felt out of place, yet they listened to him. They had to. He was the one who had changed the pace of battle, whether he intended to or not. The third cost was mechanical. As the cutters spread across the army, soldiers used them for tasks far beyond their design. They smashed through brick walls, they shoved aside vehicles, they pushed through debris meant for bulldozers, and sometimes the prongs snapped, welds tore loose, tanks became stuck when the cutters dug too deep. There were even reports of friendly fire incidents, units mistaking the silhouette of a modified Sherman for a German vehicle in fog or darkness. Culin worked tirelessly to update training materials, educating crews on how to use the cutters properly. "It's a tool," he emphasized repeatedly. "Not a miracle. You misuse it and you'll break it or get someone killed." But perhaps the strangest, most unexpected cost was psychological. As the story of his invention spread, journalists, officers, and strangers began treating him like a hero, a battlefield icon, an embodiment of American ingenuity. Soldiers approached him to shake his hand or ask him to autograph their helmets. One reporter called him the man who saved Normandy. This attention made Culin deeply uncomfortable. "I welded metal to a tank," he muttered one night to Captain Morrison. "That doesn't make me a hero." "A hero isn't always the one charging the enemy," Morrison replied. "Sometimes it's the one who sees what everyone else missed." But Culin didn't feel like he had done something heroic. He felt like he had simply solved a problem, the same way he had solved problems back in his New Jersey garage. The world, however, saw it differently, and that difference left him feeling uneasy, like he had stepped into a role he wasn't meant to play. As more hedgerow cutters rolled out onto tanks, and as the army continued pushing deeper into France, Culin realized something profound. His invention had become bigger than him. It was changing doctrine, saving lives, accelerating the war, and forcing the army to adapt in ways neither he nor anyone else expected. But the weight of that change, its good, its bad, its complicated ripple effects, would remain with him long after the tanks rolled past the hedgerows of Normandy. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the hedgerow cutters spread rapidly across the front, moving far beyond their improvised origins. What began as one mechanic's battlefield solution became a defining element of the Allied advance. The further American forces pushed into France, the more the cutters proved their value, not only in ways Culin had intended, but in ways no one had anticipated. By August, the landscape began to change. The dense, choking maze of hedgerows gradually gave way to more open ground. Fields widened, lines of sight improved. German defensive positions, once invisible behind towering vegetation, became easier to spot and target. Tanks could maneuver with greater freedom. Infantry patrols could move without risking ambush at every corner. The cutters were no longer necessary for their original purpose, but the crews didn't remove them. Instead, they discovered new uses almost by accident. In towns and villages liberated along the way, German defenders often barricaded streets with furniture, lumber, stones, and whatever they could find. Some buildings were fortified to serve as firing points against advancing troops. The cutters, still welded to the tanks, became ideal urban breaching tools. Sherman crews found that the heavy steel prongs could punch through wooden barricades, or smash through weak walls without exposing the tank to unnecessary risks. Instead of maneuvering through streets laced with traps, tanks simply created their own paths. The psychological shock of a 30-ton machine bursting through a wall was immense. German defenders occasionally abandoned positions before the tank even fired its main gun, unwilling to face a vehicle that could demolish their cover so abruptly. Culin's invention, originally meant for rural fields, was now shaping urban combat. During river crossings, troops discovered that the cutters provided unexpected help. When tanks attempted to climb muddy riverbanks, their tracks often slipped, lacking traction. But the steel prongs dug into the soil, anchoring the tank enough to pull itself upward. Soldiers wrote in after-action reports that the cutters acted like giant claws, allowing Shermans to navigate difficult terrain that might have otherwise stalled the advance. Winter brought new challenges. Snow piled high against roadsides and around vehicles. Deep drifts threatened to bog down entire columns, yet the cutters pushed through snow much like they had pushed through hedgerows, clearing paths, carving lanes, and giving tanks a surprising ability to plough ahead. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Perhaps the most surprising use came during the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had blocked key roads by felling trees, hoping to slow American counterattacks. Without engineers or heavy equipment nearby, some units feared delays long enough to disrupt their operations. Tank crews, thinking creatively, used their hedgerow cutters to shove aside or snap the trees. Logs that would have taken hours to clear manually were pushed away in minutes. One report described a Sherman that used its cutters to hook beneath a disabled German tank and drag it off the road, clearing the way for an entire armoured column. The writer described the moment with a kind of amused disbelief. "We used a tool designed to cut bushes to move a panzer." War has a sense of humour. As Culin travelled from unit to unit, documenting modifications and improvements, he realised something extraordinary. His invention was no longer simply a hedgerow solution. It had become a multi-purpose battlefield tool, adapted in ways he would never have predicted. Soldiers were not only using his device, they were innovating on top of his innovation, turning it into something far greater than he had imagined. And yet, even as the cutters helped propel the Allied forces forward, Culin couldn't shake the complex mixture of pride and discomfort that came with their success. The faster the Allies advanced, the more battles they fought, the more destruction unfolded. He understood the military value of speed, but he also understood its human cost. Still, the strategic impact was undeniable. By late 1944, the cutters had reshaped the operational tempo of the entire campaign. They had shortened the fight for Normandy, accelerated the liberation of France, and contributed to the eventual push toward Germany's borders. They even influenced future tank designs. Shermans built in the United States began to include standardized mounting points for cutters, acknowledging their role as essential equipment rather than improvisation. As the front moved deeper into Europe and winter turned to spring, Culin continued his travels, observing firsthand how his idea had evolved. He collected sketches, notes and suggestions from soldiers, fifth prongs, serrated edges, reinforcement plates, debris-clearing mechanisms. Each unit had its own version, built from the problems they encountered. The invention belonged to all of them now. Culin was simply the one who struck the first spark. During these travels, he wrote letters home trying to make sense of everything. "I never imagined this," he wrote. "I thought we'd make a few cutters for our unit. Now nearly every tank has them. They keep finding new uses. It's strange watching an idea grow into something you can't even recognize." He never boasted. He never framed himself as an inventor or hero. In his mind, he was still a mechanic solving practical problems as they appeared. But to the soldiers fighting in Europe, the cutters represented something larger, proof that a simple idea born from observation and necessity could transform a battlefield, and the biggest transformation was still ahead, the end of the war itself. As the winter snows of early 1945 began to thaw and Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the hedgerow cutters remained welded to the fronts of countless Sherman tanks. By now, they had become so common that many young replacement soldiers assumed they were simply part of the tank's original design. The memory of how essential they had been in Normandy, how revolutionary they were at the time, began to fade even as the devices continued to serve new purposes. That was, in a strange way, the ultimate proof of their success, an invention so effective that soldiers forgot there was ever a time without it. In April, as American forces approached the Rhine and German resistance began to collapse, Culin found himself with mixed emotions. The war was drawing to a close. Cities fell one after another. Prisoners surrendered in groups rather than squads. The momentum he had helped create had turned into an unstoppable tide. His invention, simple welded prongs of steel, had played a part in shortening the war by weeks, perhaps months. And in war, time meant lives. When Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945, Culin stood with his unit in a small town that had been fought over just days before. The air smelled of damp soil, diesel and smoke, scents that had become all too familiar. Soldiers cheered, cried, hugged one another. For many, it was the first time they felt truly safe in years. For others, the relief was tempered by grief for friends who hadn't lived to see this day. As Culin watched the celebrations unfold, he felt a strange hollowness mixed with relief. Yes, the war was over. Yes, the Allies had won. But his own role was hard for him to reconcile emotionally. He knew his device had saved American lives, yet he also knew that every breakthrough it enabled had resulted in the death of German soldiers on the other side of those hedgerows, men he had never met. The moral weight of that knowledge sat quietly within him. His friend Eddie Kowalski broke through his thoughts, handing him a bottle of beer liberated from a German cellar. "You're thinking too much again," Kowalski said. "It's VE Day. You're allowed to feel good." Culin took the beer, but shook his head slightly. "I'm thinking about everything that led here," he said softly. "If the first test had failed, if the crew had died, if Morrison had said no, any one of those moments could have changed the whole campaign." Kowalski sat down beside him. "Or maybe someone else would have figured it out later. Doesn't matter. You did it when it counted. And you saved a lot of us, including me." They drank in silence for a while, watching the sun dip behind rooftops shattered by artillery. Slowly, the hollowness eased. Perhaps for the first time, Culin allowed himself to feel something close to peace. The war was ending, and with it, the burden of improvisation and constant pressure. Soon he would go home. When he finally returned to New Jersey in late 1945, he resumed his old life as a mechanic. He fixed cars, tuned engines, welded tools for neighbors, and tried to leave the war behind. He didn't speak much about his invention. When asked, he would simply say, "I worked on tanks," and change the subject. To him, it wasn't something to boast about. It was a thing that needed doing during a time when everything felt urgent and fragile. His medals stayed in drawers. The field promotion became a memory. The newspaper clippings yellowed quietly. He wanted to fix things, not talk about how he once helped break through the most stubborn defenses in Europe. It wasn't until nearly 40 years later, in 1984, that a young historian named David Carter tracked him down. Carter was writing a book about battlefield innovations of World War II and insisted on interviewing the man who, in the span of 2 days, had come up with one of the most influential tank modifications of the Allied campaign. Sitting in Culin's small living room, Carter asked him, "Do you understand how important your invention was? Analysts say it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, maybe longer. It saved thousands of lives." Culin was quiet for a long moment before replying. "I wasn't special," he said. "I was just a guy who saw a problem and bothered to try something. The real miracle wasn't the idea. It's that someone listened to me. That doesn't always happen." Carter pressed him, trying to praise him further, but Culin shook his head. "Ideas come from all kinds of people. Smart, not so smart, officers, privates. The army listened. That's the part I hope gets remembered." Culin passed away in 1963, long before Carter's book was published. His obituary in the local paper mentioned only that he was a mechanic, a veteran, and a quiet man. It said nothing about the hedgerow cutters. Most of his neighbors never knew what he had done, but in military museums across America and Europe, his invention remains preserved: simple steel prongs welded to the front of a Sherman tank. They look crude at first glance, unrefined, almost improvised, but they tell a story of ingenuity, necessity, and the belief that no problem is unsolvable when someone dares to approach it differently. And though his name is known mostly to historians and tank enthusiasts, the legacy of his idea endures every time someone sees those prongs and realizes what they accomplished. In the end, Curtis Culin didn't view himself as a hero or an innovator. He viewed himself as a mechanic who refused to accept defeat by terrain. But history knows better. His simple invention helped save D-Day. His idea helped change a war. And that quiet legacy continues, welded in steel, just as he left it.